Before the Golden Towers rose in Manhattan, before the name Trump became a brand known across the world, there was another man, a man who never sought fame but built the foundation for one of America's most controversial dynasties. Fred Trump, the father of Donald Trump, was not a celebrity. He was a builder in the shadows, the son of German immigrants, armed with grit, ambition, and a ruthless eye for opportunity. He transformed empty lots into sprawling housing complexes, and in doing so, he reshaped the very fabric of New York City. But behind every brick, behind every dollar, there was a story few ever knew. Allegations of discrimination, secret deals with politicians, government programs bent into private fortune, and at home, a household ruled by discipline and pressure, where love was often measured in success, and where one son's dreams ended in tragedy, while another's hunger for approval grew into a force that one day would change the course of American history. This is not just the story of a man, it is the story of the empire he built and the shadow he cast over generations. It is the hidden blueprint of Donald Trump's rise and the untold truth of the father who shaped him. The question is not only who Fred Trump was, but what his legacy means for us all. Welcome to Fred Trump's secret legacy, the powerful father behind Donald Trump. You can tell a life by the rooms it leaves behind: a baby's blanket, a ledger with pencil smudges, a man's shoes by the back door, tiny objects that gather meaning like dust. If we press our ear to the wallpaper of the Trump family's early house in Queens, we hear a steady rhythm: construction, ledgers, the creak of floorboards as men come and go with timbers and pipe. It is a sound that will come to shape a dynasty. Frederick Christ Trump was born October 11, 1905, in the Bronx, into an immigrant lineage that smelled of coal smoke and boiled coffee. His father, Frederick Trump, had come from Bavaria with the restless energy of a man who'd chased fortune west, through Seattle, into Canada during the Klondike Rush, and then returned east with seed money and dreams of real estate. The elder Trump's death in 1918 left a family with property and plans, but little certainty. The boy Fred would inherit both the opportunities and the anxieties of that inheritance. This is where the story begins, not with marble towers or television lights, but with a modest house in Jamaica, Queens, where a family kept to the new world's modest promises. The neighborhood was changing fast in the years after the Queensboro Bridge opened. Plots that had been fields turned into boards and nails and tradesmen's calls. For a young Fred, the new century smelled like sawdust and possibility. He learned early the value of a promise well kept: pay your bills on time, keep your men working, and let the numbers lock up the night's work like a neat ledger. There's a quiet, almost stubborn care to that upbringing. Fred was not a showman. He was not a brash headline. He learned his trade the old way, as a carpenter, a laborer, a man who turned raw boards into small houses that would shelter families after the war. For someone studying the arc of power, this small apprenticeship matters. Big empires start with measured, repetitive tasks: pouring concrete, setting studs, closing windows. Each workday built a muscle of competence he would later convert into capital. Listen closely. In those first 2 minutes of his life story, you can already hear the paradox that will echo forward. A man born to immigrants, taught thrift by a mother, and fired by the example of a father who had chased fortune, learns to shape both houses and the rules of the market. He is practical, devout in his habits, and hungry for an order that will make life predictable. If you want to understand what came after, The apartments, the subsidies, the boardroom calculations. You must first understand the sound of hammers in a queen's dusk and a young man keeping track of every cent he spends. So we begin with the small, everyday acts that teach a man to rule over rentals and neighborhoods, the neatness of a ledger, the faith practiced at a kitchen table, and the single-minded repetition of building one house after another. The rest of the story will show how those small acts meet politics, war, and law, how a life built from weathered wood becomes, in time, a fortune that moves cities.
The 1920s was a decade of motion. Automobiles, skyscrapers, a dizzying sense that America's future was arriving faster than anyone had planned. For Fred Trump, it was a decade of hands and calculation. He apprenticed in carpentry, learned the taste of sawdust and the discipline of schedules, and graduated from build one, sell one to constructing entire blocks for a growing middle class. The ledger he kept was small at first, a few lines for labor, a note for shingles, but the habit of counting would scale with his ambition. When his father died, the family wasn't destitute, but the safety net had holes. Fred had to turn to work, and he turned it into a career. In the mid-1920s, he built homes, sold them, and used the proceeds to fund the next project. His company's name, Elizabeth Trump & Son, recorded the prudent involvement of his mother as the legal owner while Fred ran the day-to-day. That arrangement kept him afloat and gave him time to learn an old builder's secret. Scale increases margin when your management is good and your waste is small. Then the world tilted. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and wiped many builders from the map. Contracts dried up, credit froze, and the appetite for new houses vanished. Fred survived not through spectacular daring, but adaptation. He opened one of New York's first modern supermarkets during the lean years, a pivot that would have felt pedestrian to a man who would be known for towers, but it bought time. The lives of builders are made of improvisation as much as plan. The more significant pivot came in 1934, when the federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, created the Federal Housing Administration and the National Housing Act to restart building and ease mortgage financing. For a man like Fred, who had always kept a watchful eye on where government money flowed, this was a turning point. He acquired the mortgage book of a bankrupt Brooklyn firm at a steep discount and used the FHA's new financing mechanisms to begin building at scale again. Suddenly, the machinery he'd practiced on small houses could fill entire blocks of apartments. The New Deal was not only a national recovery program, for Fred Trump, it was an industrial opportunity. From then on, the formula was clear and repeated. Government subsidies and mortgage insurance lowered risk, efficient building and repeated design lowered costs, and ownership of completed credit-backed apartments produced long streams of rent. During the late 1930s and into the 1940s, he grew from a neighborhood builder into one of New York's substantial landlords. He learned the craft of converting federal policy into private wealth. This is not a tale of pure genius. It is a tale of attention and appetite. He developed a capacity for reading policy and placing himself at the trough of public funds. That pragmatic instinct, find the program, build the blocks, collect the rent, would be both his strength and later a source of fierce controversy. History often gives elbows to the opportunist. World War II remade global economies, and in that remaking, created new channels for profit. In 1941, America mobilized, and the Defense Department needed housing for the Navy and war personnel. For Fred Trump, whose practice was to build practical, modest apartments, an opportunity arrived on schedule. He moved into building wartime housing in places like Norfolk, Virginia, the nation's great naval hub, and he built fast, under contract, and at scale. The contracts flowed money, and crucially, allowed developers to retain ownership after the war. For a builder, that was a masterstroke of fortune. Imagine a map. Apartments icon after apartments icon, lines of mortar, rooms furnished with the almost cheerful banality of post-war life. Each unit was not merely shelter, it was a piece of financial plumbing, mortgage, rent, government guarantee. After the war, those homes remained as assets producing rent for decades. Fred's Norfolk operations alone amounted to thousands of units, a bedrock for a growing empire. It's important to be precise here. Such government programs were not unique to Fred Trump. Many builders benefited from the New Deal and wartime programs. What distinguished him was his eagerness to position himself where federal credit and contracts flowed, and his capacity to retain those assets thereafter. He became a landlord of scale by turning public purpose into private return, an act that many would later praise as savvy, others would later question on ethical grounds. These wartime profits consolidated Fred's place among New York's builders. He expanded into Brooklyn and kept purchasing mortgage books, buying properties at discounts, and using the machinery of federal financing to multiply holdings. Where once he'd turned over one home to fund another, he now held thousands and let rent pay the ledger. But power rarely arrives without critique. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, questions began to accumulate. Murmurs about rental conditions in older complexes, whispered complaints about discriminatory practices, and the first notes in the long song of public scrutiny that would follow the family for decades. For now, though, the builder kept building, his hands shaped by sawdust and policy.
In 1936, Fred Trump married Mary Ann MacLeod, an immigrant from Scotland whose quiet stature and practicality fit him like a steady foundation. Mary's presence in the household would be the counterpoint to Fred's brittle, work-driven energy, a domestic steadiness that produced 5 children over the next dozen years. Mary Ann, Fred Jr., known within the family as Freddie, Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert. These were not large, lavish births. They were the slow accrual of family life beneath the hum of building sites and city noise. Fred's home was strict. He set high expectations for table manners and discipline, enforced physical discipline at times, and kept track of his children's movements with a watchful eye. The household practiced ritual and order, dinner at a set hour, reports to a father who believed character was made by strictness and control. He was a teetotal man, shaped by the temper of his era and by a personal aversion to risk that extended beyond finance into morals. For the children, it was an upbringing of rules and hard drives toward competence. But the private life had public consequences. The family's embedded values passed readily to the eldest son, whom Fred trained for the business. Freddie was expected to inherit. Later, as personal tragedies and a bitter family dynamic would reveal, such expectations could corrode marriages and complicate loyalties. Donald, the 4th child, would receive more deliberate grooming for a life in the family firm, and the father's lessons on toughness, negotiation, and the utility of the spectacle would shape him in ways both obvious and subtle. Domestic discipline, however, did not purify the family's public reputation. Over time, accusations and legal disputes about tenant conditions and discriminatory letting practices would surface. Folk singer Woody Guthrie's songs about Old Man Trump echoed real grievances in the neighborhoods where Fred's properties stood. While his philanthropy, donations to hospitals, support for Israel bonds, gifts to local charities, won praise, the discrepancies between public generosity and private practices would become fodder for journalists and litigants alike. The family household, so tightly run, would not be able to contain the public controversies that rose around it. No empire stands apart from the public ledger. As Fred Trump's holdings grew, so did scrutiny. In the 1920s, there was an arrest during a violent clash at a Queens rally that the press described as involving Ku Klux Klan members. The record is unclear whether Fred was an active Klan participant or simply present in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the episode resurfaced decades later as part of the broader inquiry into attitudes in networks in the family's early years. The public file includes the arrest. It does not, conclusively, prove ideology. Still, such details seed narratives that will be hard to prune. Criticism hardened in the 1950s and 1960s as civil rights debates exposed patterns of segregation embedded in housing policy nationwide.
The New Deal's mortgage mechanisms and many wartime policies had tended to perpetuate segregation through programs like redlining. Those systemic flaws intersected with private practice to produce outcomes that were both public and personal. By the 1970s, the Trump Organization faced civil suits and government subpoenas, notably allegations that the family's rental practices discriminated against African American applicants, charges that eventually drew Department of Justice attention. The legal record is complex. Charges were litigated, settlements discussed, and policy reforms demanded. For Fred, critique came both from activists and from music. Woody Guthrie's songs about landlords and tenants converted local grievance into popular form. For the public, the contrast was stark. A man who donated to hospitals and bought Israel bonds was also accused of steering tenants away by race and of maintaining housing conditions that were sometimes unsatisfactory. Such contradictions, the generous public donor and the embattled landlord, would complicate his legacy and leave deep questions about how public subsidies were used and who truly benefited. At the same time, Fred's defenders argued he was an efficient builder who provided middle-class housing where none had existed before. They pointed to lines of tenants who sought out his apartments, to the scale of post-war urban housing he created, and to the stability that long-term rentals offered. The truth, as history often is, sits between competing claims. A man who built comfort, and also a man whose practices sometimes reflected the structural injustices of his era.
Power is partly architecture and partly pedagogy. Fred Trump did not merely build houses. He built a family that could steward the holdings he'd accumulated. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Trump Organization had become a generational enterprise. Yet the pedagogy of inheritance can be unforgiving. Fred had hoped that his eldest son, Freddie, would step into leadership. Family records show early expectations and official titles, and for a time the succession seemed conventional. Life is rarely straightforward, and Freddie's struggles with alcoholism and estrangement complicated the plan. The result? A younger son, Donald, rose in public prominence, and the father adjusted his investment and attention accordingly. The dynamic was practical and painful. Business decisions were intertwined with family loyalties and humiliations. Fred's relationship with Donald was not merely managerial. He taught him tactics, how to leverage meetings, how to position a rival, how to use pressure and optics to advantage. And he provided loans and guarantees that helped Donald break into Manhattan's high-stakes market in the late 1970s and 1980s. One signature anecdote in the family lore is the 1978 Commodore Hotel deal, where Fred's financial role was crucial. Later, when Donald's Atlantic City gabbles faltered, Fred stepped in with unusual interventions, such as a lawyer buying casino chips on his behalf, moves that would later raise questions about family finance and tax treatment. But beyond dollars, Fred bequeathed a way of seeing the world, a belief in aggressive deal-making, in the importance of political connections, and in keeping risk within familial walls. Those lessons would define Donald's approach to branding and politics half a century later. Fred's legacy, then, is not only in the apartments that pay rent, it is in the character he shaped, the instincts he handed down, and the family rules that made him both admired and contested. We have walked from the sawdust of early houses to the broad outlines of an empire. We have seen the pivot points: New Deal policy, wartime contracts, family discipline, public controversy. Ahead lies the complicated middle: Manhattan's bright lights, Atlantic City's casinos, legal battles over wills, and the slow public re-examination of a man who once wanted invisibility but left a name that now fills headlines. The next chapters will carry us into those arenas where money, memory, and power collide. Fred Trump was never seduced by the glitter of Manhattan in his prime. Where others dreamed of Fifth Avenue addresses, he understood something deeper about the psychology of New York. The city's true expansion was not vertical, but outward. It was in Queens, in Brooklyn, in neighborhoods where veterans returned from war, families searched for affordable rent, and schools needed to expand. While Midtown Manhattan went skyward with steel, Fred laid his bricks horizontally in regimented rows of red brick buildings with modest lawns and wide sidewalks. They weren't glamorous, but they were reliable, efficient, and deeply profitable. In the 1940s and 1950s, he filled whole tracts of Queens with what came to be called Trump homes. The formula was simple and repetitive. Use government financing to reduce costs, build large complexes of nearly identical apartments, keep rents low enough to attract steady tenants, but high enough to ensure comfortable profit margins. In time, the boroughs became his fiefdom. Thousands of families lived under roofs he built, mailed rent checks with his name on the envelope, and walked streets lined with buildings stamped by his vision of post-war prosperity. These complexes defined a generation's experience of upward mobility. For working-class families, a Trump apartment meant a bathroom of their own, a kitchen with new appliances, heating that worked. Children studied at clean desks, mothers stretched grocery money, fathers returned from shifts to buildings that looked much like every other but provided safety from the elements and hope for the future. To critics, the buildings were monotonous, soulless, rows upon rows of brick without imagination. To tenants, they were stable, a step up from crowded boarding houses or deteriorating brownstones. Fred Trump wasn't building dreams, he was building predictability. And predictability for a city still healing from depression and war was its own kind of luxury. Yet the borough focus also meant that his empire remained largely invisible to Manhattan's elite. The city's newspapers wrote endlessly about developers with gleaming towers on Park Avenue, but Fred's name rarely made society pages. He cultivated that invisibility. Fame was not the goal, revenue was. While others chased prestige, he chased margins, and in chasing them, he built a kingdom in the shadows. It was this kingdom that would later furnish Donald Trump with both wealth and frustration. Wealth because the rents and properties provided security. Frustration because Donald longed for the limelight his father had shunned. The boroughs taught the son discipline and numbers, but they also planted the hunger to escape to Manhattan's bright lights.
In New York, bricks alone don't build empires. Influence does. Fred Trump understood this truth instinctively. He was a Republican in a city dominated by Democratic machines, yet he navigated the political labyrinth with skill. During the New Deal and wartime years, he aligned with whichever officials controlled subsidies and contracts. He cultivated friendships with housing administrators, borough leaders, and local politicians. He donated generously to campaigns, attended dinners, and ensured his name was known in the rooms where zoning decisions were made. This wasn't corruption in the crude sense of bribes and envelopes. It was a softer, subtler dance, loyalty, visibility, and mutual benefit. Politicians needed housing built quickly and cheaply. Fred Trump delivered. In return, he won access to loans, favorable terms, and contracts others never saw. Political power became as much a tool of his business as cement mixers and ledgers. He learned to read not just blueprints, but budgets in Albany and Washington. He studied shifts in policy and adjusted his bids accordingly. When the FHA tightened rules, he reconfigured his financing. When the city called for veterans housing, he had proposals ready. This strategy had its costs. By aligning closely with programs and politicians, he tied his reputation to the machinery of bureaucracy. When critics accused the FHA of favoritism or housing projects of poor maintenance, his name was among those mentioned. The same networks that lifted him could also ensnare him. But in the mid-century city, this was how fortunes were built. The developer without political connections was a craftsman at best. The developer with them was a mogul. Fred Trump chose the latter role, though quietly, cautiously, always preferring the security of influence to the showmanship of celebrity. His children watched closely. Donald, especially, saw in his father's dinners with politicians and bureaucrats the outline of a lesson. Business is not just about what you build, but who you convince to let you build it. By the 1960s, America was not only building suburbs, it was rethinking who belonged in them. Civil rights movements challenged the old architecture of segregation, and housing became one of the battlegrounds. Fred Trump's empire, rooted in federally supported housing, came under scrutiny. Tenants and activists accused his company of discriminating against African Americans and other minorities in rental practices. Applications were allegedly steered, leases denied, excuses made.
In 1973, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a suit against the Trump Management Corporation, charging it with systematic racial discrimination in housing. The case was a public blow. Newspapers reported the allegations with relish, and the Trump name, which once largely confined to the boroughs, became associated with controversy. Fred and his son Donald, who by then was deeply involved in the company, denied wrongdoing. They argued that they simply sought reliable tenants and had been unfairly targeted. Eventually, they settled without admitting guilt, agreeing to terms that required reforms and monitoring. For tenants who felt excluded, the settlement was a vindication. For Fred, it was an irritation, an intrusion of politics and activism into what he saw as the practical business of managing property. He resisted the framing of discrimination, preferring to think of his empire as neutral, as if brick and mortar had no race. But in practice, his buildings reflected the systemic patterns of their time. Lines drawn through neighborhoods, opportunities divided unequally, and profits made at the intersection of housing and prejudice. The controversy foreshadowed later battles Donald would face in politics. It also revealed the paradox of Fred's legacy, a man who built homes for thousands, yet whose practices contributed to the exclusions and inequalities that scarred American cities. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Donald Trump had become not just Fred's son, but his apprentice. The father and son duo attended meetings together, negotiated loans together, and surveyed construction sites side by side. Fred was stern, calculating, focused on margins. Donald was brash, ambitious, drawn to style and spectacle. Their partnership was productive, but tense. Fred valued discipline and anonymity. Donald craved boldness and fame. At family dinners, Fred drilled his children on thrift and toughness. Donald absorbed the lessons, but twisted them into a new register. Where his father said, "Avoid risk, keep control," Donald heard, "Dominate, never back down." Yet without Fred's guidance, Donald's rise would have been impossible. Fred provided the capital, the guarantees, and the credibility that allowed his son to step onto Manhattan's grand stage. When Donald negotiated his first major deal, the renovation of the Commodore Hotel in 1978, it was Fred's money and political connections that made the impossible possible. The mentor passed down more than dollars. He modeled negotiation as combat, loyalty as currency, and reputation as armor. He showed Donald how to court politicians, how to secure loans, and how to leverage government programs to private advantage. In return, Donald gave Fred something he had never sought: visibility. The Trump name began appearing in newspapers, not just in real estate listings, but in society columns. For the elder Trump, it was a risky form of fame. For the younger, it was intoxicating. The mentor and the apprentice were bound together, one cautious, one flamboyant, one content in the boroughs, the other restless for Manhattan and beyond. Their relationship would shape not only the Trump Organization, but the destiny of American politics decades later.
In the 1980s, Donald Trump's expansion into Atlantic City brought both glitter and peril. Casinos promised high returns, but demanded endless cash to keep the tables running. When Donald's ventures stumbled, Fred re-entered the spotlight in a way he never intended. In 1990, as Donald faced a cash crunch at the Trump Castle Casino, Fred Trump dispatched a lawyer with millions of dollars to purchase casino chips that were never played. It was, in effect, a covert loan disguised as business activity. The move drew regulatory scrutiny and forced Donald to return the money, but it revealed the depth of Fred's loyalty and the family's willingness to bend rules to protect its own. For Fred, it was an echo of his lifelong habit: use whatever tools are at hand, government programs, contracts, or family networks, to secure survival. For Donald, it was proof that his father's fortune was a backstop he could lean on when risks went wrong. The episode exposed the blurred lines between father and son, between empire and individual. It also exposed Fred to unwanted publicity. For decades, he had avoided Manhattan's bright lights. Now, through Donald's gambles, his name appeared in casino investigations and financial headlines. The rescue was effective in the short term, but costly in reputation.
It tied Fred's legacy to Donald's risk-taking and set the stage for critics to question how much of the son's empire was built on the father's quiet, disciplined fortune. By the 1990s, Fred Trump was an old man in decline. The builder who had once surveyed blocks of brick apartments with hawk-like precision now struggled with memory. Alzheimer's disease slowly stripped him of the habits and routines that had defined his life. He spent his final years under the care of his family, the strict patriarch now vulnerable, dependent on others for the routines he had once enforced. His children watched as the man who had ruled their household with iron discipline faded into gentleness and confusion. Fred Trump died in 1999 at the age of 93. His funeral was attended by family, business associates, and political figures. For many tenants in Queens and Brooklyn, his passing barely registered. The rent checks still went out, the buildings still stood. But for those who studied power, his death marked the close of a chapter in American capitalism. He left behind a fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, carefully structured to minimize taxes and maintain family control. He left behind a dynasty that would carry the Trump name from boroughs to boardrooms to, eventually, the Oval Office. And he left behind questions about how much of his success was genius, how much was subsidy, how much was compromise, about how a man who built homes could also exclude tenants, about how a man who avoided fame produced a son who craved it. The final years closed the ledger on Fred Trump's life, but opened the debate that still echoes. What is the true legacy of the man who built the foundation for America's most controversial political dynasty? When Fred Trump died in 1999, his empire did not dissolve. It was parceled out through a carefully constructed estate plan, one that bore the hallmarks of a man who had spent a lifetime counting every dime and structuring every deal. His fortune, estimated between $250 and $300 million, became the subject of family meetings, lawyers' documents, and inevitably, disputes. The Trump children inherited not just wealth, but the machinery of a dynasty. Donald, already the most public of Fred's heirs, became the visible face of the Trump organization. Marianne, a federal judge, carried the family's name into law. Robert, the quieter son, handled business operations. Elizabeth remained less in the public eye, while the memory of Freddie, the eldest who had died tragically in 1981, hovered as an unspoken reminder of the family's complexity. But beneath the surface of inheritance ran deeper questions. How much of Fred's fortune had been shifted during his lifetime into trusts and tax shelters? How much had been transferred quietly to Donald and others through loans and guarantees? Investigative journalists later unearthed records suggesting that the family engaged in aggressive tax strategies, inflating invoices, creating shell companies to pass wealth across generations while minimizing obligations to the state. For some, this was evidence of cunning. For others, evidence of manipulation. The will, then, was more than a document. It was a mirror, reflecting both Fred's lifelong obsession with control and the family's skill at bending systems to their advantage. Inheritance became not only financial, but cultural, a legacy of building, leveraging, and preserving wealth through careful navigation of law and loophole. And yet, in a very human sense, the will could not erase the tensions within the family. Lawsuits emerged over healthcare arrangements for Freddie's children, disagreements over distributions, and accusations that power had once again been unevenly applied. Even in death, Fred Trump remained a presence, a father whose fortune bound his children together while also prying them apart.
Every dynasty carries its wound. For the Trump family, that wound was Freddie Trump. The eldest son was, in the beginning, the chosen heir. Handsome, charismatic, he seemed destined to inherit the company his father had built. But Freddie had other dreams, dreams that wandered beyond ledgers and construction sites. He longed for the sky, training to be a pilot, finding joy not in balance sheets but in cockpits. Fred could not understand. To him, aviation was frivolous, unreliable, dangerous. Housing was the safe bet, the steady rent, the empire that grew quietly. Father and son clashed, the patriarch pressing, the heir resisting. In the Trump household, disobedience was not tolerated, and Freddie's refusal to embrace the business was seen as weakness. The conflict deepened into estrangement. Freddie struggled with alcoholism, his marriage frayed, and by 1981 he was gone, dead at 43, his life consumed by pressures that seemed unbearable. His death shook the family, but also hardened it. Donald, years later, would speak of Freddie's struggles as a warning, an example of why toughness mattered and why vulnerability was fatal. But Freddie's shadow remained. For his children, for his siblings, for the story of the family, his absence was a haunting presence. Mary Trump, Freddie's daughter, would later write of the cruelty, the pressure, the emotional vacuum that she believed had contributed to her father's downfall. Her account reopened the wound and forced the public to ask, what did it cost to build a dynasty? Fred Trump's legacy, then, is not only measured in bricks and dollars, but in the lost potential of a son who wanted to chart his own course. Freddie's tragedy is the underside of discipline, the consequence of a household where deviation from the plan was seen as failure. His life reminds us that dynasties are not only built, they are sacrificed. With Freddie gone, Donald Trump stepped into the spotlight as the heir apparent. The transition was not quiet. Where Fred had built with discretion, Donald built with spectacle. His entry into Manhattan real estate was marked by audacity. The renovation of the Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt in 1978, the construction of Trump Tower in 1983, and the branding of his name in gilded letters across skylines. Fred had taught him the mechanics, how to leverage loans, how to work political connections, how to bend government programs. But Donald added a layer of performance. He courted the press, staged his life as theater, and transformed real estate into entertainment. For Fred, the son's showmanship was foreign, but the results were undeniable. The Trump name, once hidden in the boroughs, now glowed in lights visible from Fifth Avenue. The father supported the son financially, backing projects with loans and guarantees, but their visions diverged. Fred wanted steady rents. Donald wanted headlines. Fred avoided risk. Donald embraced it. The result was a dynasty expanding in two directions at once, one built on quiet efficiency, the other on public spectacle. Donald's rise did not erase his father's presence. It depended on it. The wealth, the connections, the reputation of reliability, all were Fred's gift, whether Donald acknowledged it or not. But in the public's eye, the elder Trump receded, overshadowed by a son who had mastered television and branding in ways the father never imagined. Yet the DNA of Fred's teachings was everywhere in Donald's empire. The aggression in negotiations, the comfort with controversy, the belief that politics and business were inseparable. The son's ascent was not a break from the father, but an evolution of him, turned outward, louder, riskier. Fred Trump's life offers lessons that are both practical and unsettling. He showed that fortunes are often built not merely on talent, but on timing, knowing when government opens a door, when policy creates opportunity. He demonstrated that political connections can be as valuable as hammers and nails. He embodied the principle that discipline and repetition, building rows of brick apartments, filing ledgers with precision, can create empires just as surely as innovation. But his lessons also carried shadows. He revealed how discrimination could be woven quietly into housing policy, how exclusion could accompany opportunity. He showed that wealth can be multiplied through systems designed for the public good, raising questions about fairness and equity. For Donald, these lessons became instinct. He inherited not only a fortune but a worldview, that winning requires toughness, that rules are negotiable, that success is measured not by fairness but by scale. Fred's discipline became Donald's bravado. Fred's caution became Donald's gamble. Fred's private influence became Donald's public performance. These lessons of power are not unique to the Trumps. They are the DNA of American capitalism itself, visible in every generation of tycoons. But in Fred's story, they are distilled into a single lifetime. From immigrant son to patriarch, from modest builder to political force, from anonymity to the father of a president. The lessons linger. They invite admiration for his tenacity, criticism for his methods, and reflection on the systems that allowed him to thrive. Above all, they remind us that power is never simply personal. It is structural, generational, and always a legacy.
Fred Trump gave millions away: hospitals, charities, scholarships, Israel bonds. His philanthropy was steady and visible. In Brooklyn and Queens, institutions benefited from his checks, his name engraved on plaques,
his generosity noted in local papers. But philanthropy, like business, was complicated. For tenants living in poorly maintained apartments, for applicants denied housing, the generosity seemed selective. Woody Guthrie's songs about Old Man Trump captured the bitterness of tenants who saw landlords profit while families struggled. To them, philanthropy was not redemption, but performance. Fred believed his giving was sincere, an obligation rooted in faith and tradition. He tithed to his church, supported hospitals, and contributed to civic causes. He did not see contradiction between building wealth through controversial practices and redistributing it through donations. In his mind, the two balanced. The paradox remains unresolved. Was philanthropy a way to cleanse reputation, or was it genuine faith in giving back? Was it a mask or a mirror? For historians, the answer may be both. For tenants, the answer depended on whether their rent check came with heat in winter or leaks in the ceiling. This paradox, too, shaped Donald. His philanthropy, his foundations, his public gestures of giving, all can be traced to the model of a father who saw wealth not only as personal fortune, but as a tool for influence, reputation, and obligation. Fred Trump never sought celebrity. He did not crave magazine covers or television spots. His power was exercised in the shadows, in boardrooms, in banks, in backroom meetings with politicians. He was a builder of structures, not images. And yet, by remaining in the shadows, he became the architect of one of America's most visible dynasties. His fortune, his teachings, his discipline created the stage upon which Donald Trump would perform. Without Fred, there would be no Trump Tower, no casinos, no television persona, no White House run. The irony is sharp. The man who avoided attention fathered one of the most attention-seeking figures in modern history. The man who built quietly became the foundation for a family that would dominate headlines for decades. Fred's story, then, is not just about real estate. It is about legacy, how one man's pursuit of security can ripple outward into spectacle, controversy, and power beyond his imagination. He was a builder in the shadows, but his shadow was long, stretching from the boroughs of New York to the center of American politics. Dynasties are not only about money. They are about continuity, the careful passing of values, habits, and power from one generation to the next. By the late 19th century, Fred Trump had ensured that the Trump name was not a mere surname, but a brand, a signal of permanence in New York real estate. He had accomplished this in ways both practical and psychological. Practically, he left behind an empire of thousands of apartments, producing steady cash flow that anchored the family's fortunes. Psychologically, he had imprinted his children with a way of seeing the world. Life was a competition, weakness was fatal, and success required relentless effort. His family reflected this imprint in different ways. Mary Ann became a federal judge, her rulings shaped by discipline and rigor. Robert became a steady business hand, loyal to the family firm. Elizabeth preferred quieter paths, avoiding the glare. Freddie's absence was felt in silence, his death a reminder of the costs of not conforming to the family script. Donald, flamboyant, restless, insatiably ambitious, took the lessons and twisted them into performance. The dynasty solidified through contrast as much as continuity. Each sibling bore some mark of their father's expectations, whether through obedience, resistance, or reinvention. But all of them, in different ways, carried Fred Trump with them, in their careers, their choices, their very sense of identity. For outsiders, the Trump dynasty appeared as wealth. For insiders, it was discipline, a family culture as carefully managed as any ledger. Fred had not only built apartments, he had built a lineage. And yet, dynasties are fragile. They survive not only by preserving wealth, but by adapting to new times. In Donald's rise to fame in politics, the Trump dynasty adapted in ways Fred never envisioned. But at its root lay the structures he had built, the financial scaffolding, the worldview, the very habits of ambition.
The story of Fred Trump is not only his own, it is the story of a dynasty he set in motion, one that continues to shape America long after his death.
Fred Trump's life is often framed as a version of the American dream. The son of immigrants, he rose from modest beginnings to become one of the largest landlords in New York. He turned government programs into private fortune, built homes for thousands, and left his children secure. On its face, the story fits the narrative America loves to tell. But dig deeper, and the dream becomes more complicated. The opportunities he seized were not equally available to all. Federal housing policies favored white families and excluded minorities. Subsidies designed to expand access often entrenched segregation. Fred's own practices mirrored those biases, reinforcing lines of exclusion. For those who benefited, Fred Trump was proof that America rewarded hard work and discipline. For those denied, he was proof that the system was rigged, that the American dream was selective. The same man could be hailed as a builder of opportunity and condemned as a gatekeeper of inequality. This duality reflects the nation itself. The post-war boom lifted millions but left others behind. The dream was real, but it was uneven. Fred Trump's empire embodied both sides, the stability it provided to many and the doors it closed to others. To question Fred Trump's legacy is to question the dream itself. Was it a meritocracy, or was it privilege disguised as merit? Was it genius, or was it exploitation of government largesse? Was it a triumph of ambition, or a story of systemic inequity? The answers depend on where one stood, in the warmth of a Trump apartment or outside its doors denied a lease. By the time Fred Trump's name became widely known outside of New York, it was often through the controversies surrounding his son. Donald's presidential campaign revived interest in the father's record, the discrimination suits, the rumored connections, the wartime contracts. Journalists dug into archives, neighbors recalled stories, and Fred's life was re-examined in the harsh light of politics. Some remembered him as generous, a man who donated to hospitals and charities, who quietly helped neighbors and institutions. Others remembered him as harsh, a landlord whose properties suffered neglect, a man whose practices reflected the biases of his era. Both memories were true, and both clashed in the public sphere. The reputation of Fred Trump became a battlefield not only about history, but about the present. Was Donald Trump the product of a disciplined, successful father, or the heir to a tainted fortune built on exploitation? Political debates used Fred's memory as ammunition, a way to explain or indict the son. But reputation is never only about fact, it is also about narrative. For every tenant who resented him, there was a family that credited him with affordable housing. For every critic who saw corruption, there was an admirer who saw industriousness. Memory is plural. Fred Trump cannot be reduced to a single portrait. He exists in the recollections of thousands, as a strict father, a calculating businessman, a charitable donor, a controversial landlord. His reputation is not fixed, it is fluid, shaped by the stories we choose to tell. In the end, memory is the final currency of legacy. For Fred Trump, that currency remains contested. When Donald Trump placed his hand on the Bible in January 2017 and took the oath of office, the shadow of Fred Trump stretched all the way to the steps of the U.S. Capitol. The father who had once walked construction sites in Queens had, indirectly, built a path to the presidency. Fred did not live to see it. He died nearly 2 decades earlier when Donald was still known as a celebrity developer and reality TV star. But his influence was undeniable. The lessons of toughness, of deal-making, of political connections, all of them were on display in the son's campaign. The family fortune, accumulated in borough apartments, had helped fund the ventures in image-making that propelled Donald onto the national stage. The father of a president is rarely a household name, but in this case, Fred Trump's imprint was profound. His emphasis on winning at all costs, his comfort with controversy, his reliance on government while decrying waste, these threads ran through the son's politics. The irony is striking. Fred Trump avoided fame, seeking security over spectacle. Donald craved it, making himself a brand. Yet the son's ascent to the presidency was inseparable from the father's foundation. Without Fred's empire, Donald's platform would have been far smaller.
Without Fred's teachings, Donald's worldview would have been different. To call Fred Trump the father of a president is both literal and metaphorical. He provided not only DNA, but doctrine, not only fortune, but philosophy. He shaped not just a family, but indirectly the trajectory of a nation. And so the story of Fred Trump cannot be confined to borough apartments. It extends to Washington, to global headlines, to the lives of millions touched by policies and politics his son advanced. The quiet builder of Queens became, through legacy, a shaper of history.
Every empire extracts a cost. For Fred Trump, the cost was measured not only in money, but in relationships, in reputations, in the burdens carried by those closest to him. He was a man obsessed with numbers, ledgers, contracts, rents collected. But behind the arithmetic lay human lives, tenants, workers, family members, each bearing the weight of his ambition. Tenants sometimes lived with leaky roofs and peeling paint, while the landlord remained more interested in financial discipline than repairs. Workers knew him as stern, exacting, a man who demanded perfection but seldom offered warmth. His children grew up in a household where love was measured less in affection and more in expectation, where failure was punished and success was assumed. The empire gave them wealth, security, and opportunity, but it also gave them pressure, conflict, and estrangement. Freddie's tragedy, Donald's constant striving for approval, the family's later lawsuits over inheritance, all of these were the costs of living within Fred Trump's world. And yet, from another angle, the empire provided shelter for thousands of families, stability for workers, philanthropy for institutions. For every story of hardship, there was another of gratitude. The truth of the cost lies somewhere between. Empires are never pure. They are mixtures of gain and loss, of generosity and exploitation, of pride and regret. Fred Trump's empire was no different. Its cost was borne by the many, but its rewards shaped history. In examining that cost, we are forced to ask, what do we value more, the buildings left standing, or the people left standing after them? Fred Trump's life was not just his own. It was a reflection of America itself, its ambition, its contradictions, its promise, and its failures. He rose during the Great Depression, thrived during the post-war boom, and left behind a fortune that reflected both ingenuity and inequality. His story is inseparable from the nation's story. America loves the narrative of the self-made man. Fred Trump embodied it, an immigrant's son who built from scratch. But America also struggles with the truth that success is rarely solitary. Fred's rise depended on government subsidies, on political connections, on policies that privileged some while excluding others. His empire was not only self-made, it was system-made. In this sense, Fred Trump's life holds a mirror to America. It shows how ambition and opportunity can lift a family from modest origins to extraordinary influence. But it also shows how that journey can deepen divides, leaving some outside the gates of the very dream they are told to pursue. The mirror is uncomfortable. It forces us to see that America's promise is real but conditional, that success often rests on invisible scaffolding, loans, laws, loopholes, that behind every mansion and tower there are untold stories of those who built, those who were excluded, and those who paid the price. Fred Trump did not invent these contradictions. He embodied them. His life, his fortune, his family, they are America, in miniature and in magnification. To study him is to study ourselves. And perhaps that is why his story matters more than ever, because in his rise we see both the brilliance and the blemishes of the nation he called home. Legacies are not only about what is built, they are about what lingers. For Fred Trump, his legacy is both visible and invisible. It is visible in the brick apartments across Brooklyn and Queens, in the institutions that bear his donations, in the wealth passed to his children.
It is invisible in the values instilled, the worldview transmitted, the shadow cast across generations. Donald Trump's presidency brought that legacy into global view. The toughness, the instinct for spectacle, the disregard for convention, all were rooted in a father's teachings. The fortune that enabled campaigns and branding was seeded decades earlier in borough projects. The shadow of Fred Trump stretched farther than he ever imagined. But beyond politics and headlines, there remains the quieter legacy. The families who grew up in Trump apartments, the communities shaped by his developments, the children who learned discipline at his dinner table. Some remember him with gratitude, others with resentment. All remember him with impact. In the end, Fred Trump was not a celebrity, not a statesman, not a cultural icon. He was a builder of homes, of fortunes, of family, of a dynasty that would reshape American history. His name may not glow in golden letters like his son's, but without him, those letters would not exist. His story leaves us with questions more than answers. What does it mean to succeed? What is the price of ambition? Can legacy be both celebrated and condemned? Can we forgive the flaws while recognizing the achievements? As we step back, one image remains. Fred Trump walking a construction site in Queens, ledger in hand, eyes fixed not on the present, but on the future. He could not have foreseen how far that future would reach, but he built it, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, lesson by lesson. And perhaps that is the truest measure of legacy. Not fame, not fortune, but the shadows we cast that outlive us. Fred Trump's shadow remains, a reminder that behind every towering figure stands another, less seen, but no less powerful.